Sometimes the things we throw away are exactly what someone else needs most. In life, we've all felt overlooked, dismissed, or counted out when we still had so much to give. At a dusty livestock auction in Red Creek, Arizona, an old donkey named Jeremiah limped onto the auction block. He was scruffy and tired, and every rancher in the crowd laughed at the sight of him. The auctioneer couldn't get a single bid. But one cowboy named Sam Tucker saw something different. When Sam bid $2, the whole crowd called him a fool. They said he was wasting money on an animal that should be put out of its misery. But this rejected old donkey was about to change Sam's life forever and teach an entire town about seeing value where others see nothing. Could a $2 donkey really make a cowboy rich? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning. Sun cast long shadows across the Red Creek Valley as Sam Tucker walked his fence line, checking for breaks that his meager savings couldn't afford to fix. At 43, Sam carried the weathered look of a man who'd spent half his life fighting the Arizona desert for every blade of grass his cattle could eat. His hands, calloused from years of honest work, gripped a one fence post that needed replacing along with about 50 others he couldn't afford. Sam's small ranch sat on the outskirts of Red Creek, a town that had seen better days when the railroad still stopped there regularly. Now it was just another dusty spot on the map where folks scraped by, helping each other when they could, and keeping their troubles to themselves when they couldn't. The Tucker place had been in his family for 3 generations, started by his grandfather who'd homesteaded here with nothing but determination and a strong back. The leather-bound Bible his father had given him sat on the kitchen table every morning, its pages yellowed with age and thumbed soft from daily reading. Samuel Tucker Sr. had taught his boy that every creature had purpose, that God didn't make mistakes, and that a man's worth wasn't measured by his bank account, but by his character. Those lessons had served Sam well through good times and bad, though lately there seemed to be more bad than good. His wife Sarah emerged from their modest farmhouse, shading her eyes against the morning glare. She'd married Sam 12 years ago, knowing full well she was hitching her wagon to a man who'd never be rich in money, but was wealthy in all the ways that mattered. Sarah had her own strength, born from growing up as the only daughter of the town's former doctor. She understood hardship and sacrifice, and she'd never once complained about their simple life. "Bill Henderson's coming by this afternoon," she called to him across the yard. The mention of the bank manager's name sent a familiar knot of worry through Sam's stomach. Henderson wasn't a bad man, but he carried bad news more often than not. These days. "I figured he might," Sam replied, walking back toward the house. "The mortgage payment's due next week." Sarah nodded, but her eyes held that look of quiet strength she always got when times were tough. She'd sold her grandmother's wedding ring 3 months ago to help with the last payment. Though she'd tried to hide it from Sam, he noticed everything about his wife, including the pale band of skin where the ring used to sit. Red Creek's main street stretched all of 6 blocks, anchored by Martha Fleming's General Store on one end and the First Bank of Red Creek on the other. Martha had run that store for 27 years, taking it over when her husband passed. She knew every family story, every struggle, and every small victory. Her store served as the town's unofficial gathering place, where news traveled faster than wildfire and gossip was sorted from truth with the wisdom of experience. The monthly livestock auction brought the only real excitement Red Creek saw these days. Ranchers from 3 counties would gather at the stockyards behind Jameson's Feed and Supply, buying and selling cattle, horses, and whatever else folks needed to move. It was part business, part social event, and part entertainment for anyone looking to break the monotony of desert life. Sam had attended every auction for the past 5 years. Though he rarely bought anything, Mostly he went to see neighbors, check market prices, and dream about the day he might have enough cash to bid on quality stock. He'd learned to read the other bidders, to spot the serious buyers from the tire kickers, and to appreciate the rhythm of auctioneer Pete Martinez's rapid-fire chant. The stockyards themselves told stories of boom and bust, prosperity and struggle. Built during better times, they could handle twice the volume of livestock that came through nowadays. The wooden pens showed their age, and the auction block bore the scars of thousands of hooves and boots. It was a working man's cathedral, where value was determined not by fancy words but by cold, hard cash and practical need. Pete Martinez had been calling auctions longer than most folks could remember. His voice carried the authority of experience, and his eye missed nothing in the crowd. He could spot a reluctant bidder from 50 yards away and coax one more, raise out of someone who'd already spent more than they intended. But Pete was fair, and everyone knew it. He'd helped more than one struggling rancher get a fair price for stock they couldn't afford to keep. The Tuesday before the auction, Sam sat at his kitchen table with the monthly bill spread out before him like a poker hand he couldn't win. The numbers never seemed to add up right, no matter how many times he rearranged them. The ranch was barely breaking even, and that was in a good month. One major expense, a sick cow, a broken water pump, a truck repair, and they'd be behind. Again, you know what your daddy always said, Sarah reminded him, setting a cup of coffee at his elbow. The Lord provides, but sometimes he expects us to do the looking. Sam smiled at that. His father had been full of such sayings, little nuggets of wisdom wrapped in country common sense. The old man had seen his share of hard times and had always found a way through them with faith, work, and the occasional stroke of luck that he insisted wasn't luck at all. The day of the auction dawned clear and hot, with the kind of dry wind that made everything seem crisp and urgent. Sam finished his morning chores early, checked on his small herd of cattle, and cleaned up for the trip to town. He had exactly $37 in his wallet. Not enough to buy anything substantial, but enough to make him feel like a participant, rather than just a spectator. The stockyards buzzed with activity as trucks and trailers arrived from across the county. Cowboys in their best working clothes mingled with weekend ranchers wearing newer boots and cleaner hats. The serious buyers clustered near the auction ring, studying their catalogs and making notes about lot numbers and estimated values. Sam found his usual spot on the bleachers, third row back where he could see everything, but wasn't close enough to accidentally catch the auctioneer's eye. He'd learned that lesson years ago when an inadvertent wave had cost him $40 for a calf he couldn't afford and hadn't wanted. The auction moved with practiced efficiency through cattle, horses, and farm equipment. Sam watched the familiar dance of bidding, the subtle signals, the poker faces, and the occasional burst of competitive fever that drove prices higher than anyone expected. He recognized most of the buyers and could predict with fair accuracy who would bid on what. As the day wore on and the crowd thinned, Pete Martinez's voice began to show the strain of hours of auctioneering. The quality of livestock had declined as they worked through the catalog, moving from prime breeding stock to work animals to whatever odds and ends folks needed to move. That's when they brought out Jeremiah. The old donkey limped onto the auction block like he was apologizing for taking up everyone's time. His gray coat was patchy and dull, his ears drooped with age, and one of his back legs favored the others with each careful step. Someone in the crowd chuckled, then another, until a wave of laughter rippled through the remaining bidders. Pete. Martinez looked down at his notes, then up at the donkey, then back at his notes as if hoping they might have changed. "Well, folks," he said, with the tone of a man trying to make the best of a bad situation, "here we have lot number 47. One donkey, age. Well, let's just say he's got some experience under his belt." The laughter grew louder. Someone called out, What's the glue factory paying these days? Another voice shouted. I've seen livelier animals in a taxidermy shop. Even Pete couldn't suppress a grin as he looked out at the amused crowd. But Sam Tucker wasn't laughing. He was studying the old donkey's eyes, and what he saw there made him sit up straighter. There was intelligence in those dark brown depths, and something else, a patience that spoke of wisdom rather than resignation. The donkey might be old and worn, but he wasn't broken. There was still strength in that compact frame, still purpose, in the way he held his head despite the mockery surrounding him. Let's start the bidding at, let's say $5, Pete announced, though his tone suggested he wasn't optimistic about even that modest opening. Silence stretched across the stockyards like a held breath. The donkey stood perfectly still, as if he understood he was being judged and found wanting. A few more chuckles rippled through the crowd, but they sounded less amused now and more uncomfortable, like people who'd realized their joke wasn't as funny as they'd thought. How about $3? Pete tried, his voice carrying a note of genuine sympathy for the old animal. Come on, folks, he's got to be worth $3 to somebody. More silence. Sam felt something stirring in his chest, a familiar feeling he got when he saw something others had missed. It was the same instinct that had led him to buy his best bull calf from a rancher who thought the animal was too small. The same feeling that had guided him to Sarah when other men had dismissed her as too independent and strong-willed. $2, Pete called out, his voice now carrying more plea than professional enthusiasm. Surely someone can find $2 worth of use for this old fellow. Sam's hand went up before he'd consciously decided to bid. The movement was as natural and inevitable as drawing breath. Around him, heads turned in surprise, and the laughter that had been dying out suddenly roared back to life. Sam Tucker's finally lost his mind, someone called out. Throwing good money after bad. $2 for $2 worth, another voice added. That's about right. But Sam kept his eyes on the donkey, and for just a moment, he could have sworn the old animal looked directly at him with something that might have been gratitude or recognition. Sold to Sam Tucker for $2, Pete announced, bringing his gavel down with a sharp crack that seemed to punctuate not just the sale, but something larger and more significant than anyone in the crowd yet understood. The $2 bill. Sam Tucker, pulled from his worn leather wallet, had been folded and unfolded so many times that the corners had gone soft and the ink had faded to a gentle gray-green. His grandfather had given it to him 20 years ago, claiming it was lucky money that should only be spent on something truly worthwhile. Sam had carried it ever since, through lean times when $2 could have bought groceries, through desperate moments when every penny counted. Now, as he handed it to Pete Martinez's assistant, he wondered if an old donkey qualified as worthwhile, or if he'd finally cracked under the weight of too many worries and too little sleep. The laughter that followed him out of the auction ring felt like a physical thing, pressing against his back as he walked toward the holding pens. Voices carried on the hot afternoon air, each comment sharper than the last. Sam's finally bought himself a pet for the retirement home. $2 for 20 years of regret. That donkey's gonna eat more than he's worth in a week. Sam kept walking, his boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. He'd endured worse mockery before, when he'd married Sarah, despite folks saying she was too good for him. When he'd started his ranch with nothing but hope and determination. When he'd stood by his principles, even when it cost him business. The opinions of others had never guided his decisions, and they wouldn't start now. At the holding pen, Jeremiah stood in the shade of a weathered mesquite tree, his head hanging low but his ears twitching at every sound. Up close, Sam could see the full extent of the donkey's condition. His hooves needed trimming, his coat required grooming, and several minor cuts and scrapes suggested he hadn't been well cared for in recent months. But his eyes remained bright, and when Sam approached the fence, Jeremiah raised his head with unmistakable dignity. "Well, old fellow," Sam said quietly, leaning against the fence rail. "Looks like we're stuck with each other." The donkey took a cautious step forward, then another, until he stood close enough for Sam to reach through the fence and touch his muzzle. The skin was soft and warm, and when Jeremiah didn't pull away, Sam felt the first stirring of real connection. Loading Jeremiah into his trailer took patience and gentle coaxing. The donkey clearly hadn't been handled much lately, but he wasn't mean or difficult, just careful, as if he'd learned to be wary of human intentions. Sam talked to him throughout the process, the same low, steady voice he used with skittish cattle or nervous horses. By the time they were ready to leave, Jeremiah had relaxed enough to accept a handful of oats from Sam's palm. The drive home felt longer than usual, partly because Sam kept checking his rearview mirror to see how his new companion was handling the trailer, and partly because he was dreading the conversation that awaited him. Sarah had been supportive when he'd left for the auction, but she'd assumed he was going to look, not buy. Explaining a $2 donkey purchase to a woman who balanced their books down to the penny would require all the diplomatic skills he possessed. Sarah was waiting in the yard when he pulled up, her hands on her hips in that universal pose that meant a wife had questions and expected answers. She watched in silence as Sam backed the trailer to the small corral behind their barn, her expression unreadable, but her posture suggesting she was reserving judgment. "So," she said as Sam climbed down from the truck, "I take it the auction was ... productive?" "I bought us some help," Sam replied, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Name's Jeremiah. He's got experience." "Experience doing what, exactly?" Sarah asked, but her tone had softened. She'd learned to trust her husband's instincts over the years, even when they didn't make immediate sense. "I'm not entirely sure yet," Sam admitted. "But there's something about him, Sarah. Something the others missed." When they unloaded Jeremiah into the corral, Sarah's practical eye took inventory of their new addition with the thoroughness of a woman accustomed to making every dollar count. She noted the donkey's age, his condition, his obvious need for care, and the additional expense he represented. But she also saw the way he held himself, the intelligence in his gaze, and most importantly, the way her husband looked at the animal with the same quiet confidence he'd shown when he'd proposed. To her, with nothing to offer but love and possibility. "Wow," she said finally, "I suppose we'll need to fix up that old lean-to-shelter. And he'll need proper feed, not just pasture grass." Sam felt his shoulders relax for the first time since making the bid. Sarah's practical acceptance meant more to him than any amount of cheering from the auction crowd would have. That evening, as the desert air cooled and the first stars appeared, Sam sat on the corral fence and watched Jeremiah explore his new home. The donkey moved carefully but purposefully, testing the strength of the fence, locating the water trough, and investigating every corner of his enclosure. His behavior suggested familiarity with ranch life, as if he'd lived in such places before and knew what to expect. "You know," Sam said aloud, not caring if he sounded foolish talking to a donkey, "folks back in town think I've lost my mind. Maybe they're right, but I've got a feeling about you, old man. A feeling that says you're worth more than $2. Jeremiah paused in his exploration and looked directly at Sam, his ears pricked forward in unmistakable attention. For a long moment, they regarded each other across the fading light. Two creatures who'd been underestimated by the world, finding themselves unexpectedly partnered in whatever adventures lay ahead. The next morning brought the first test of Sam's investment. Bill Henderson arrived precisely at 10 o'clock, his banker's suit immaculate despite the desert heat, his expression carrying the careful neutrality of a man who delivered unwelcome news for a living. He carried a leather briefcase that Sam knew contained papers with numbers that didn't favor the Tucker family's continued ownership of their ranch. "Morning, Sam," Henderson said, accepting the offered cup of coffee but remaining standing on the porch. "I suppose you know why I'm here." "The mortgage payment," Sam replied. "It's due next week." "That's right. And given the challenges you've faced meeting recent obligations, the bank needs some assurance that this payment will be made on time." Sam felt the familiar weight of financial pressure settling on his shoulders. The ranch was barely breaking even, cattle prices were down, and he just spent 2 of his last $37 on a donkey that half the county thought was worthless. "I'll have the payment," Sam said, though he wasn't entirely sure how. Henderson nodded politely, but his eyes moved past Sam to where Jeremiah stood in the corral, obviously curious about the visitor. "I see you've made an addition to your operation." "That's Jeremiah," Sam said. "Picked him up at yesterday's auction." "I heard about that," Henderson replied, and his tone suggested the story had already made its way through Red Creek's efficient gossip network. "Folks are calling it interesting decision-making. Folks don't always see the full picture," Sam said quietly. After Henderson left, Sam walked out to the corral where Jeremiah waited with what seemed like patient expectation. The donkey approached the fence immediately, no longer wary of his new owner's presence. "Well, partner," Sam said, scratching behind Jeremiah's ears, "looks like we've got a week to prove everybody wrong. Think you're up for it?" Jeremiah's response was to push his head against Sam's hand, a gesture that felt less like casual affection and more like a promise, as if he understood exactly what was at stake and was ready to do his part. That afternoon, Sam decided to test his new helper's abilities. He'd planned to move his small herd of cattle from the south pasture to the north section, a job that usually required hours of patient work and considerable effort. Leading Jeremiah on a rope, he headed toward the pasture with modest expectations and significant curiosity. What happened next defied every assumption anyone had made about the old donkey's capabilities. Jeremiah took one look at the scattered cattle and seemed to understand immediately what needed to be done. Without direction from Sam, he positioned himself at the far end of the herd and began moving the animals with subtle pressure and patient persistence. But it was more than just competence. It was intelligence. Jeremiah anticipated which direction the cattle would try to break, cut off escape routes before they became problems, and worked with an efficiency that spoke of years of experience. Within an hour, all 15 head were contentedly grazing in their new location, and Sam was looking at his $2 purchase with new eyes. "I'll be damned," he murmured, watching Jeremiah methodically drink from the stock tank as if moving cattle was the most natural thing in the world. "Where did you learn to do that, old man?" As the sun set over the Red Creek Valley, Sam Tucker felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a drowning man grasping for straws, but the steady confidence of someone who'd found exactly what he needed. Even if he hadn't known he was looking for it, tomorrow would bring new challenges, and the bank payment loomed like a storm cloud on the horizon. But tonight, as he watched Jeremiah settle comfortably into his new home, Sam allowed himself to believe that sometimes the things others threw away were exactly what you needed most. The hand-carved wooden water bucket that Sam's grandfather had made 60 years ago sat by the well, its weathered cedar still holding water as faithfully as the day it was finished. 3 generations of Tuckermen had used that bucket, and now it would serve a 4th generation that included Jeremiah. Sam filled it each morning at dawn, part of a routine that had taken on new meaning since the donkey's arrival. Jeremiah had been on the ranch for 3 days, and already the rhythm of their work together felt as natural as breathing. The old donkey seemed to anticipate Sam's needs before Sam himself knew what needed doing. When Sam headed toward the tool shed, Jeremiah would position himself near the gate. When it was time to check the fence line, The donkey would wait patiently by the truck, understanding somehow that he was expected to come along. "Never seen anything like it," Sam told Sarah over breakfast on Thursday morning. "It's like he's been here all his life, knows exactly what needs doing and when." Sarah smiled over her coffee cup. She'd been watching the partnership develop from the kitchen window, and she had to admit that her husband's instincts seemed to be proving themselves. "Maybe he has been here all his life," she said. "Just took him a while to find his way home." That morning's work involved repairing a section of fence damaged by last month's storm. Sam loaded his tools into the old pickup truck, and Jeremiah took his position in the truck bed as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The donkey had learned to brace himself against the tailgate during turns and seemed to enjoy the breeze ruffling his ears as they bunked along the ranch roads dotted the damaged fence section. Sam began the tedious process of replacing broken posts and restringing wire. Jeremiah wandered nearby, occasionally picking at the sparse desert grass, but always keeping one eye on his human partner. When Sam needed a particular tool, he'd often find it had somehow moved closer to his reach. When a post needed steadying while Sam dug, Jeremiah would position himself just where his weight could provide the needed support. The work went faster than it ever had before, and Sam found himself talking to Jeremiah as if the donkey could understand every word. Maybe he could. The intelligent gleam in those dark eyes suggested comprehension that went beyond simple animal instinct. "You know, partner," Sam said as he stretched new wire between posts, "folks in town still think I'm crazy for buying you. Martha Fleming asked Sarah yesterday if I'd been drinking at the auction." Jeremiah's ears twitched forward at the mention of town, and he turned his head toward the distant road that led to Red Creek. For a moment, his expression seemed almost wistful, as if he had memories of that place that went deeper than his brief appearance on the auction block by noon. They'd completed work that Sam had expected would take all day. As they loaded tools back into the truck, Sam noticed Jeremiah staring intently toward the canyon country that bordered the ranch to the east. The donkey's posture had changed, becoming alert and purposeful in a way that Sam hadn't seen before. "What? Is it, old man?" Sam asked, following Jeremiah's gaze toward the rugged landscape of red rock and scattered junipers. "Something interesting out there?" Instead of answering, which would have been expecting a lot, even from Jeremiah the donkey, began walking purposefully toward the canyon area. He paused after a few steps and looked back at Sam as if inviting him to follow. Curious, Sam climbed back into the truck and drove slowly alongside as Jeremiah picked his way through the scrub brush and rock. The donkey moved with surprising sure-footedness for an animal his age, navigating rough terrain as if he'd traveled this route many times before. They continued for nearly a mile before Jeremiah stopped at the edge of a shallow wash where winter runoff had carved a channel through the red earth. The donkey stood perfectly still, his attention focused on something Sam couldn't identify. The area looked unremarkable, just another stretch of high desert landscape, marked by erosion and scattered with the usual collection of rocks, cactus, and hardy desert plants. But Jeremiah seemed to see something more. He walked a careful circle around one particular spot, his nostrils flaring as if he were following a scent. Then he began pawing at the ground with one front hoof, not frantically, but with deliberate purpose. Sam climbed down from the truck and walked over to investigate. Where Jeremiah had been digging, the desert had given up a small object that gleamed dully in the afternoon sun. Sam knelt and brushed away the loose dirt, revealing what appeared to be an old horseshoe, not the machine-made variety common today, but hand-forged iron with the irregular shape and rough finish of earlier craftsmanship. "Well, I'll be damned," Sam muttered, turning the horseshoe over in his hands. "Where do you suppose this came from, Jeremiah?" The donkey had moved on to another spot nearby, once again pawing at the ground with that same purposeful intensity. This time, his efforts revealed a rusted piece of metal that might once have been part of a bridle or harness, along with what looked like fragments of very old pottery. Sam felt a stirring of excitement he couldn't quite explain. These weren't modern artifacts dropped by careless campers or hunters. The horseshoe alone suggested someone had been working this area long ago, possibly during the territorial period when Spanish influences were still strong in the region. "How did you know these were here, partner?" Sam asked, but Jeremiah had already moved on to a third location, his behavior suggesting this was far from random digging. They spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the wash, with Jeremiah leading and Sam following in growing amazement. The donkey seemed to have an uncanny ability to locate spots where the desert had preserved remnants of human activity. Besides the horseshoe and bridle fragments, they found pieces of rusted metal that might have been tools, more pottery shards, and several other items too weathered to identify clearly. Each discovery raised new questions. Who had been working this remote area, and when? Why had they left so many artifacts scattered through the wash? Most intriguingly, how had Jeremiah known where to look? As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Sam loaded their finds into the truck and headed home. Jeremiah rode in the truck bed as usual, but his attention kept returning to the canyon country they were leaving behind. Whatever had drawn him to that particular area clearly held significance beyond a few old artifacts. That evening, Sam spread their discoveries on the kitchen table while Sarah examined each piece with the careful attention of someone who'd grown up hearing stories of the old days from her father. "This horseshoe is definitely hand-forged," she said, running her finger along its irregular edge. "Probably Spanish colonial period, maybe even earlier. And look at these pottery fragments. The designs are different from anything local tribes made." "So we're talking about old-timers," Sam said. "People who were here long before Red Creek was even a town." "More than that," Sarah replied thoughtfully. "People who were working the land, not just passing through. You don't leave this many artifacts unless you've been somewhere for a while." Sam leaned back in his chair and looked through the kitchen window toward the corral where Jeremiah stood in the evening shadows. The donkey was facing east again, toward the canyon country, as if he were keeping watch over something important. "Sarah," Sam said quietly, "what if those folks weren't just working the land? What if they were working something in the land?" His wife looked up from the pottery fragments, understanding immediately what he was suggesting. The Spanish had been miners as well as ranchers, always searching for precious metals to send back to their homeland. If they'd established a presence in this remote area, it might not have been for grazing or farming. "You think there might be an old mine out there?" Sarah asked. "I think," Sam said, "that Jeremiah knows more about this land than any of us suspected. And I think tomorrow we're going to find out just how much." Outside in the corral, Jeremiah raised his head as if he'd heard his name mentioned. For a moment, his silhouette against the darkening sky looked less like a discarded farm animal and more like a guardian keeping watch over secrets that had waited decades to be discovered. The $2 donkey was proving to be worth considerably more than anyone had imagined, and Sam Tucker was beginning to suspect their story was just getting started. The Spanish horseshoe sat on Martha Fleming's counter like a piece of evidence waiting for a detective. Sam had brought it to town Friday morning, along with the pottery fragments and metal pieces Jeremiah had helped him uncover. If anyone in Red Creek would know the significance of these artifacts, it would be Martha. Her general store served as the unofficial historical society, and her memory held decades of stories passed down by the area's oldest families. Martha examined the horseshoe through her reading glasses, turning it over in her weathered hands with the reverence of someone who understood the weight of history. At 72, she'd lived in Red Creek long enough to remember when some of the old-timers who'd witnessed the territories transitioned to statehood were still alive and telling stories. "Sam Tucker," she said finally, "where exactly did you find this?" "Out in the canyon country east of my place," Sam replied. "Jeremiah led me right to it." Martha's eyebrows rose at the mention of the donkey. Like everyone else in town, she'd heard about Sam's peculiar auction purchase, though she'd been more diplomatic in her comments than most. "That old donkey found this." He knew exactly where to look, Sam said, like he'd been there before. Martha set the horseshoe down carefully and disappeared into the back room of her store. Sam could hear her moving boxes and muttering to herself as she searched for something. When she returned, she carried a cardboard carton filled with old papers, photographs, and documents. "My late husband was something of a local historian," she explained, setting the box on the counter. "He collected stories and documents about the early days, back when this was all territorial land. I've been meaning to donate these to the state Historical Society, but they keep getting pushed to the back burner." She pulled out a folder filled with photocopied documents and began sorting through them. There were Spanish mining operations all through this region in the 1800s, she continued. Most people don't realize how extensive they were because the mines were abandoned when the Spanish pulled out, and later settlers didn't always find them again. Sam felt his pulse quicken. Mining operations? Silver, mostly. The Spanish were always looking for silver. Martha pulled out a hand-drawn map that looked like it had been copied from something much older. "This is a territorial survey map from 1874. See these marks here? They indicate known mine sites, though most of them were already abandoned by then." Sam studied the map, trying to orient himself to landmarks he recognized. The Red Creek Valley was clearly marked, along with the mountain ranges and major geographical features. And there, in the canyon country east of where his ranch now sat, were several small symbols that Martha identified as mine markers. "The legend says these Spanish operations were quite productive for a while," Martha continued, "but they were also secretive. The Spanish didn't want to advertise their mineral wealth, so they kept their mining locations closely guarded secrets." "What happened to them?" Sam asked. "Same thing that happened to a lot of Spanish enterprises in this region: political changes, conflicts with local tribes, economics that didn't make sense anymore. Most operations just shut down and walked away, leaving everything behind." Martha pulled out another document. This one, a photocopied page from what appeared to be a territorial government report. This mentions a particularly productive silver mine in the Red Creek area that employed a substantial workforce and produced significant quantities of ore for nearly 15 years before being abandoned in 1847. Sam felt something cold settle in his stomach, not fear, but the kind of excitement that comes with the recognition of genuine opportunity. 15 years is a long time to be working one location. Long enough to establish quite an operation, Martha agreed. The report mentioned support facilities, worker housing, even livestock. Livestock? Mules and donkeys, mostly. Essential for moving ore and supplies in mountainous terrain. Martha looked at Sam with new interest. "You know, there are stories about animals that lived at these old mine sites developing almost supernatural knowledge of the area. Horses and mules that could find their way through canyon systems in complete darkness. Donkeys that could locate water sources that had been forgotten for decades." The implications hit Sam like a physical blow. He thought about Jeremiah's uncanny knowledge of the canyon terrain, his ability to locate artifacts buried in the desert, his purposeful behavior when exploring the wash. What if the old donkey hadn't just wandered into the Red Creek area? What if he'd been born there, lived there, worked there? "Martha," Sam said carefully, "how long do donkeys typically live?" "Oh, quite a long time if they're well cared for. 30 years, sometimes more." She paused, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Sam, You're not thinking that old donkey of yours. I'm thinking a lot of things, Sam replied. None of them making much sense yet, but all of them pointing in the same direction. Martha pulled out a magnifying glass and examined the horseshoe again, paying particular attention to its size and shape. You know, this shoe is smaller than what you typically see on a horse, more like what you'd use on a mule or donkey. Sam felt the pieces of a puzzle clicking together in his mind, even though he couldn't see the complete picture yet. Martha, could I borrow this map and these documents? I'd like to study them more carefully. Of course, but Sam, Martha's voice carried a note of caution. Even if there were mines out there once, that doesn't mean there's anything left to find. These operations were abandoned more than a century ago. Maybe, Sam said, carefully folding the map. But abandoned doesn't necessarily mean empty. The drive back to the ranch felt different now. Charged with possibility and weighted with questions, Sam wasn't sure he was ready to answer. The familiar landscape looked the same, but his understanding of it had shifted. Every ridge and canyon might hold secrets. Every wash might conceal evidence of activities that predated the town. The railroad, everything he'd thought of as the beginning of. Local history. Sarah was waiting in the yard when he pulled up, her expression expectant. She'd learned to read her husband's moods, and something in his posture told her the trip to Martha's store had been more than routine. What did you find out? She asked as Sam climbed down from the truck. Maybe nothing, Sam replied. Maybe everything. He spread Martha's documents on the kitchen table and explained what he'd learned about Spanish mining operations in the area. Sarah studied the old map with the same careful attention she gave to their monthly bills, tracing routes and noting landmarks with her finger. If this is accurate, she said finally, there could be several old mine sites within a few miles of here. That's what I'm thinking. And I'm also thinking that Jeremiah might know where they are. They looked through the kitchen window toward the corral, where Jeremiah stood in the afternoon shade. The donkey was facing east again, toward the canyon country, his attention focused on something beyond their sight. Sam, Sarah said quietly, what if you're right? What if he really did come from one of those old mines? What would that mean? I don't know yet, Sam admitted. But I think we're about to find out. That afternoon, Sam saddled his horse and led Jeremiah back toward the canyon area where they'd made their first discoveries. This time, he brought a camera, a notebook, and a small shovel, along with the old map Martha had loaned him. Jeremiah moved through the terrain with even more purpose than before, as if their previous exploration had reawakened something in his memory. He led Sam along a route that seemed random but felt deliberate, winding through washes and around rock formations with the confidence of someone following a familiar path. They traveled deeper into the canyon system than Sam had ever ventured before, through narrow passages between towering red rock walls and across meadows hidden in the folds of the desert landscape. The silence was profound, broken only by the sound of their movement and the occasional call of a canyon wren echoing off the stone walls. After nearly 2 hours, Jeremiah stopped at the mouth of a side canyon Sam hadn't noticed on previous trips. The entrance was partially concealed by fallen rocks and overgrown with desert scrub, but there was definitely a passage leading deeper into the rock formation. Sam dismounted and approached the opening cautiously. The air flowing from the canyon mouth felt cooler than the surrounding desert, suggesting the passage extended well into the rock. More importantly, the ground near the entrance was littered with artifacts, pieces of rusted metal, fragments of pottery, and what looked like the remains of wooden structures long since reduced to weathered splinters. My God, Jeremiah, Sam whispered. You found it, didn't you? You found one of the old mines. The donkey's response was to walk purposefully into the canyon entrance, disappearing into the shadows beyond. Sam grabbed his flashlight and followed, his heart pounding with excitement and apprehension. The passage opened into a wider canyon after about 50 yards, and what Sam saw there made him stop in his tracks. Carved into the canyon walls were unmistakable signs of mining activity, tool marks in the stone, the remains of wooden support structures, and most significantly, several dark openings that could only be mine shafts. But it was more than just a mining site. The canyon held the remnants of what had once been a substantial operation. Sam could make out the foundations of buildings, the remains of corrals and work areas, even what appeared to be a blacksmith shop built into a natural cave in the canyon wall. Jeremiah moved through the abandoned settlement as if he were coming home. He walked directly to a particular spot near the largest mine opening and began pawing at the ground with that same purposeful intensity Sam had witnessed before. This time, the donkey's digging revealed something that made Sam's breath catch in his throat. Buried in the desert sand was a piece of silver ore, its metallic veins clearly visible even after decades of weathering. Sam knelt and picked up the ore sample, feeling its weight in his palm. It was real silver, substantial enough to suggest the mine had been productive, recent enough to indicate the veins might not be exhausted. As the significance of the discovery settled over him, Sam realized that everything in his life was about to change. The struggling ranch, the mortgage payments, the constant worry about making ends meet, all of that might become history if this abandoned mine still held the treasures that had made it valuable to the Spanish. But even more than the potential wealth, Sam felt a deep sense of connection to this place and to Jeremiah's role in leading him here. The old donkey hadn't just found artifacts or interesting historical sites. He'd led Sam home to a place where he'd lived and worked, where he'd been valued and needed, where he belonged. As the sun began to set behind the canyon walls, Sam Tucker stood in an abandoned Spanish silver mine, holding a piece of ore that might represent the answer to all his financial problems. With a $2 donkey who just proved himself worth more than anyone could have imagined. The greatest treasures, Sam reflected, sometimes did come with the longest ears. The faded mining map Martha had loaned Sam spread across his kitchen table like a treasure chart from an adventure story, its edges yellow with age and its penciled markings barely visible in the morning light. Sam had been studying it since dawn, comparing the hand-drawn landmarks with his mental picture of the canyon country, where Jeremiah had led him to the abandoned mine. Sarah poured coffee and looked over his shoulder at the document that it consumed her husband's attention for the past 3 days. "Any luck matching up the locations?" "Some," Sam replied, pointing to a cluster of small symbols near what appeared to be a creek bed. "These markings here could correspond to the canyon system where we found the mine. And look at this notation." He indicated a faded line of Spanish text written in the margin of the map. Sarah leaned closer, squinting at the nearly illegible words. "Can you make out what it says?" "My Spanish isn't great, but I think it's something about the faithful burro knows the way." Could be coincidence, could be referring to pack animals in general, or it could be talking about Jeremiah specifically, Sarah finished. "Sam, this is starting to feel less like coincidence and more like destiny." Through the kitchen window, they could see Jeremiah in his corral, standing in his usual morning position facing the canyon country. The donkey had been restless for the past few days, as if their discovery had awakened something in him that demanded action. "I need to go back out there," Sam said. "With proper equipment this time. If that mine is still productive, I want to know about it before I get Bill Henderson's hopes up." Sarah nodded, understanding the caution in her husband's voice. They'd been disappointed before by opportunities that seemed promising but led nowhere. "What kind of equipment?" "Rope, lanterns, sample bags. Maybe some basic mining tools if I can borrow them." Sam folded the map carefully. "And I want to take Jeremiah. If anyone knows the safe way through those mine shafts, it's him." An hour later, Sam loaded his truck with borrowed mining equipment from 3 different neighbors. Word of his activities had spread through Red Creek's efficient gossip network, but the speculation had taken on a different tone. Instead of mockery about his foolish donkey purchase, people were asking questions about what he'd found out in the canyons. Tom Bradley, who ran the hardware store, had loaned Sam a miner's helmet with a working lamp. "My grandfather used this in the copper mines over in Bisbee," he said. "If you're really going underground, you'll need proper lighting." Jake Morrison had contributed rope and pulleys from his construction business. "This stuff's rated for serious." "Wait," he told Sam. "Whatever you're planning to haul up from down there, this'll handle it." Even Pete Martinez, the auctioneer who'd sold Jeremiah to Sam, had stopped by with a canvas bag and some tools. "My family did some prospecting back in the day," he explained. "These belonged to my uncle. Figure they ought to see some use again." The change in attitude was subtle but unmistakable. Sam was no longer the fool who'd wasted $2 on a worthless donkey. He was the man who might have stumbled onto something significant, and his neighbors wanted to be part of the story. At the ranch, Sam loaded Jeremiah into the trailer with more care than usual. The donkey's cooperation suggested he understood. They were returning to the mine site, and his eagerness was almost palpable. As they drove toward the canyon country, Sam found himself talking to his passenger through the trailer's front window. "Well, partner, today we find out if you've led me to the real thing or just another dry hole. Either way, I want you to know, I don't regret that $2 bid. You've already given me more than my money's worth in surprises." The drive to the canyon entrance took 40 minutes over increasingly rough terrain. Sam had blazed a basic trail on previous trips, but the route still required careful navigation around boulders and through washes that could trap an unwary vehicle. At the canyon mouth, Sam unloaded his equipment and let Jeremiah out of the trailer. The donkey immediately began moving toward the mine site, but this time his behavior was different. Instead of the casual exploration of previous visits, Jeremiah moved with urgent purpose, as if something had changed in their absence. Following the donkey deeper into the canyon, Sam noticed things he'd missed before. The remains of old structures were more extensive than he'd initially realized. What he'd taken for random rock piles were actually the foundations of buildings. The blacksmith cave held the remnants of a forge and anvil. Most significantly, there were signs that the mine had been worked more recently than the 1840s abandonment, date suggested by Martha's documents. Jeremiah led him to the largest mine opening and stopped. His attention focused on the dark passage that led into the rock. Sam strapped on Tom Bradley's mining helmet, checked his equipment, and prepared to enter the mine that might change his life forever. The passage sloped downward at a gentle angle, the walls showing clear evidence of hand excavation. The air was cool and dry, with no sign of the dangerous gases that could accumulate in old mines. Most importantly, the tunnel showed signs of recent activity, footprints in the dust. Marks where someone had scraped samples from the walls, evidence that he wasn't the first person to explore this site in recent years. 50 feet into the tunnel, Sam's headlamp illuminated something that made him stop short. Cut into the rock wall was a wooden sign. Its paint faded, but still legible. Santa Elena Mine, Est, 1834. Productive to 1898. 1898, Sam whispered to himself. Not 1847. This mine was worked for more than 60 years. The tunnel branched ahead, with passages leading in 3 different directions. Sam chose the center route, which showed the most recent signs of foot traffic. The passage opened into a natural chamber where his headlamp revealed the full scope of the mining operation. The chamber was extensive, with multiple tunnel openings radiating in all directions. The walls glittered with veins of silver ore that had been partially worked but not exhausted. Most remarkably, the chamber contained equipment that suggested mining activity had continued well into the 20th century. Metal ore carts, modern drilling equipment, and electric cables that had been strung along the tunnel walls. Sam examined the silver veins more closely, using his pocket knife to scrape samples from the wall. The ore was rich, with silver content that appeared substantial even to his untrained eye. More importantly, the veins extended deep into the rock, suggesting reserves that could support significant mining operations. As he collected samples and made notes, Sam heard a sound that made him freeze, the distant echo of hoofbeats in the tunnel system. For a moment, he worried that Jeremiah had followed him into the mine, but the sound was too heavy, too numerous to be one donkey. Moving cautiously toward the sound, Sam discovered another chamber that took his breath away. It was a natural stable, carved from the living rock, with stalls and water troughs that had been maintained in working condition. And occupying those stalls were 3 donkeys and 2 mules, all in excellent condition, all clearly well cared for. But most amazing of all was Jeremiah, standing in the center of the stable as if he belonged there, being nuzzled and welcomed by the other animals like a long-lost family member. Returning home. An elderly voice spoke from the shadows behind Sam, causing him to spin around in surprise. I wondered when someone would finally follow old Jeremiah back home. Standing in the tunnel entrance was a man Sam had never seen before. Weathered, white-haired, wearing clothes that suggested he'd been living rough for years. But his eyes were sharp and intelligent, and his posture suggested strength despite his apparent age. "Name's Carlos Mendoza," the stranger said. "I reckon it's time I told someone the real story of the Santa Elena mine." Sam stared at the old man, his mind racing with questions. "You've been working this mine?" "Working it, protecting it, keeping it ready." Carlos stepped into the chamber, and the animals moved toward him with obvious affection. "Been waiting 20 years for Jeremiah to bring the right person back here." 20 years? Carlos nodded toward Jeremiah, who stood calmly among his companions, as if the reunion was exactly what he'd been planning all along. "That old donkey's got a job, too. And he's not the kind to quit until it's finished. Question is, are you the man he's been looking for?" As Sam Tucker stood in an underground stable filled with livestock he didn't know existed, listening to a man who'd been living in a supposedly abandoned mine for 2 decades, he realized that his $2 donkey purchase had led him into a story far more complex and valuable than he'd ever imagined. The real treasure, it seemed, wasn't just silver ore buried in the rock. It was the loyalty and purpose of an old donkey who'd never forgotten where he belonged or what he was meant to do. The piece of silver ore Carlos Mendoza placed in Sam's palm caught the light from the mining helmet and threw back a gleam that spoke of genuine wealth. It was larger than the sample Sam had found earlier, heavier, with veins of pure silver running through the rock like metallic rivers frozen in stone. This came from the main vein, about 200 feet deeper in the tunnel system, Carlos explained, settling onto a wooden crate that served as a chair in the underground stable. "Been taking samples for 20 years, keeping track of the ore quality and quantity. Never sold any of it. Just wanted to know what we were sitting on." Sam examined the ore sample with growing amazement. Even his inexperienced eye could see that this was high-grade silver, the kind that made mines profitable and men wealthy. "Carlos, why haven't you worked this mine yourself? Why wait for someone else?" The old man's weathered face creased into a smile as he reached out to scratch Jeremiah behind the ears. "Because it ain't really my mine to work. This place belongs to Jeremiah, and Jeremiah's been waiting for his true partner to find him." "I don't understand." Carlos stood and walked to a wooden chest in the corner of the stable. From it, he pulled a leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by decades of handling. "This belonged to my grandfather, Miguel Mendoza. He was the foreman of the Santa Elena mine from 1878 until it closed in 1898. He opened the journal to a page marked with a faded ribbon, revealing handwritten entries in Spanish. Miguel wrote about a young donkey that came to the mine as a colt back in 1885. Called him Al. Feel the faithful one. That donkey worked these tunnels for 15 years. Knew every passage, every vein, every safe route through the mountain. Sam looked at Jeremiah, who stood quietly among the other animals, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight with unmistakable intelligence. "You're saying that's the same donkey?" "I'm saying," Carlos replied carefully, "that some animals live longer than others, especially when they've got work to finish. And I'm saying that old Jeremiah there has been trying to get back to this mine for more years than most folks would believe." Carlos turned to another page in the journal, this one containing a detailed map of the tunnel system drawn in Miguel's careful hand. The mine closed when silver prices dropped and the easy ore played out. But Miguel's notes indicate they barely scratched the main vein. "There's enough silver in this mountain to make several men wealthy, if it's worked proper and respectful." Respectful? This ain't just a hole in the ground, Sam. This is a living place with its own spirit, its own way of doing things. The Spanish understood that. They worked with the mountain, not against it. That's why their mines lasted so long and produced so well. Carlos closed the journal and looked directly at Sam. "My grandfather left instructions that if the mine ever reopened, it should be by someone the mountain chose, someone Jeremiah trusted. I've been the caretaker, keeping the tunnels safe, maintaining the equipment, waiting for the right person." Sam felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a physical thing. "What makes you think I'm the right person?" "Because Jeremiah chose you," Carlos said simply. "At that auction, he could have gone to anyone for $2. But he waited for you because he recognized something in you that the others missed." The implications of what Carlos was suggesting began to dawn on Sam. This wasn't just about finding an abandoned mine or striking it rich on silver ore. This was about accepting stewardship of something that had been carefully preserved and protected, something that came with obligations as well as opportunities. "Carlos," Sam said slowly, "what exactly are you proposing?" The old man smiled and gestured toward the tunnel entrances that led deeper into the mountain. "I'm proposing we become partners. You've got the legal right to work this land, the reputation, in town to make things official, and most importantly, the trust of Elfield there. I've got 20 years of experience with this mine, knowledge of where the best ore lies, and a crew of animals that know every inch of these tunnels." "A crew?" Carlos whistled softly, and the donkeys and mules in the stable moved toward him with obvious discipline. "Meet the Santa Elena mining crew. These animals were born in this mountain, raised in these tunnels. They can haul ore, carry supplies, and navigate passages that would challenge experienced miners. They've been waiting as long as Jeremiah has for the mine to reopen." Sam looked around the stable with new understanding. This wasn't just a refuge for abandoned animals. It was a functioning operation, maintained and ready for production. The water troughs were clean, the feed bins were full, and the animals themselves were in excellent condition. "You've been caring for all of them this whole time?" "Someone had to," Carlos replied. "The mountain provides what we need water from. Underground springs, shelter in the tunnels, even some grass in the hidden meadows back in the canyon system. We've been a family, waiting for the day we could do what we were meant to do." Carlos led Sam to the mouth of the main tunnel, where a fresh breeze carried the scent of deep earth and metallic ore. The silver vein runs for nearly a mile through the mountain. Sam, Miguel's journal indicates they'd only worked about a third of it when the mine closed. The rest has been waiting all this time. How much silver are we talking about? Enough to pay off your ranch, set you and Sarah up comfortable for life, and probably leave something substantial for your children if you have them. Carlos paused, studying Sam's expression. "But it's not just about the money. This mine has a purpose, a reason for being. The silver comes out of the mountain because the mountain wants to provide for the people who respect it. Sam felt a chill. That had nothing to do with the cool air flowing from the tunnel. The rational part of his mind wanted to dismiss Carlos's mystical talk about the mountain having wants and purposes. But standing in an underground stable with a donkey who'd somehow led him to exactly what he needed most, rationality seemed less important than faith. What would be expected of me? Sam asked. Honest work, Carlos replied. Fair treatment of the animals and the mountain. And a promise that the silver will be used for good purposes, not just personal wealth. Sam thought about his struggles with the ranch, Sarah's sacrifices, the mounting debts that threatened to take away everything his family had built. But he also thought about his neighbors who'd helped him with equipment, the community that had supported him despite their doubts about his judgment. Carlos, he said finally, if we do this, it's not just for me. There are others in Red Creek who could use some of the prosperity this mine might bring. The old man's smile broadened into a grin that made him look decades younger. Now you're starting to understand why Jeremiah chose you. As if summoned by his name, Jeremiah walked over to Sam and gently nudged his arm. The donkey's touch felt like an agreement, a sealing of the partnership that had begun with a $2 bid at a dusty livestock auction. All right, partner, Sam said, scratching behind Jeremiah's ears. I guess we're going into the mining business. The silver ore. Sample in his pocket felt warm against his hand, as if it carried the promise of everything that was about to change. But more than the potential wealth, Sam felt the satisfaction of purpose, the knowledge that he was exactly where he was meant to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The $2 donkey had led him home, not just to a place, but to a destiny that had been waiting for him all along. The leather journal Carlos pulled from a wooden chest deep in the mine's main chamber was different from his grandfather Miguel's mining records. This one was smaller, more personal, with a cover so worn that the original color was impossible to determine. When Carlos opened it carefully, Sam could see that the pages were filled with a different handwriting, more delicate, more emotional than the practical notations of a mine foreman. This belonged to Father Sebastian Morales, Carlos explained, his voice carrying a reverence that made Sam lean closer. He was the priest who ministered to the mining families back in the late 1880s and 1890s, but he was more than just a priest. He was the one who understood the real story of this place. Carlos turned to a page marked with a pressed wildflower, its colors faded but still recognizable as desert marigold. The entry was dated September 15th, 1885. Written in Spanish but with enough familiar words that Sam could catch fragments of meaning. What does it say? Sam asked. Carlos cleared his throat and began translating, his voice taking on the cadence of someone reading a beloved story. Today a miracle arrived at the Santa Elena mine in the form of a young burro, no more than 2 years old, who appeared at our gates as if sent by Providence itself. The animal shows intelligence beyond his years and a connection to this sacred mountain that defies explanation. Sam felt something stir in his chest as he looked at Jeremiah, who stood quietly nearby as if listening to his own story being told. Carlos continued reading. Miguel has named him Elfio, but I believe his true name is written in the stones of this mountain. He knows passages that we have not yet discovered, and he leads our miners to veins of silver that our surveys missed. It is as if the mountain speaks to him directly. That sounds like, Sam began, but Carlos held up a hand. There's more. He turned the page carefully. I have lived long enough to recognize the sacred when it appears before me. This burro is not merely an animal. He is a guardian, a keeper of this mountain's treasures, sent to ensure that the silver serves its proper purpose. The old miners speak of such creatures in whispers, animals that live far beyond their natural span because they have work that transcends the ordinary world. Carlos closed the journal and looked directly at Sam. Father Sebastian wrote about Jeremiah for 13 years, documenting things that would sound impossible to most people. But I've lived with that old donkey for 2 decades, and I've seen enough to know that some things can't be explained by ordinary understanding. Carlos, Sam said carefully, are you telling me that Jeremiah is the same donkey that Father Sebastian wrote about in 1885? I'm telling you what I know, Carlos replied. I'm telling you what I've witnessed. And I'm telling you what my grandfather told me before he died, that El Fao would return when the mine was ready to fulfill its true purpose. Carlos opened the journal to its final entries, the pages near the back where Father Sebastian's handwriting had grown shaky with age. Listen to this, from 1898, just before the mine closed. The silver is not gone from this mountain, only waiting. El Fao knows where it sleeps, and when the time is right, he will lead the chosen one to awaken it. I have hidden what needs to be hidden, preserved what needs preserving, and blessed this place to wait for its true inheritor. Sam felt his worldview shifting in ways that made him dizzy. Everything he thought he understood about his $2 donkey purchase, about random luck and good timing, was rearranging itself into something far more profound and purposeful. There's something else, Carlos said, leading Sam deeper into the chamber to where a natural alcove had been carved into the rock wall. Something Father Sebastian left for whoever would eventually reopen this mine. Inside the alcove, wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved it perfectly, was a small wooden box. Carlos lifted it carefully and handed it to Sam. Go ahead, open it. Sam lifted the lid with trembling hands, revealing contents that made him gasp aloud. The box contained silver coins, but not ordinary currency. These were Spanish colonial pieces, beautifully crafted, each one bearing dates from the 1880s and 1890s. But more significant than their age or potential value was their quantity. The box was filled with coins, enough to represent substantial wealth even by today's standards. Beneath the coins was a folded letter, written in English in Father Sebastian's careful script. Sam opened it and read aloud. To the one who follows El Fao home. This silver was set aside from the mine's production over 13 years, 1 coin for each month the guardians served faithfully. It represents not wealth, but trust. The mountain has been waiting for someone who understands that true treasure is not what we take from the earth, but what we give back to our community. Use this silver wisely, and the mountain will provide abundance beyond your imagining. Ignore its lessons, and even the greatest riches will turn to dust in your hands. El Fao will know your heart. Trust his judgment, for he has waited longer than any of us can comprehend. Sam sank onto a wooden crate, overwhelmed by the implications of what he'd discovered. This wasn't just about finding silver or striking it rich. This was about accepting responsibility for something sacred, something that came with moral obligations as weighty as its financial potential. Carlos, he said quietly, how long have you known about all this? Since I was 12 years old, Carlos replied. My grandfather brought me here when he was dying, showed me the journal, introduced me to Jeremiah, and made me promise to be the caretaker until the right person appeared. And you've been here ever since? Not continuously. I've had a life outside this mountain family, work, responsibilities. But I've always come back, always checked on the mine, always made sure Jeremiah and his companions were cared for. Carlos smiled. 20 years ago, I realized my caretaking was almost finished. Jeremiah was getting restless, looking toward the valley more often, as if he sensed his true partner was finally approaching. Sam looked at Jeremiah, who had moved closer during their conversation and now stood within arm's reach, his dark eyes reflecting the lamplight with unmistakable intelligence and something that looked remarkably like affection. So when I bid on him at the auction, you weren't buying a donkey, Carlos finished. You were accepting a calling. Jeremiah didn't need rescuing. He needed a partner worthy of the treasure he's been guarding. the weight of silver coins in. The wooden box felt like the weight of destiny in Sam's hands. He thought about his struggling ranch, his mounting debts, his wife's quiet sacrifices. But he also thought about Father Sebastian's warning, about the difference between taking from the earth and giving back to the community. "Carlos," Sam said finally, "if we do this right, if we honor what Father Sebastian intended, how much silver are we really talking about?" The old man's smile carried decades of patient waiting. "Enough to change Red Creek forever, Sam. Enough to make sure no family in that valley ever goes without the basics they need. Enough to build schools, repair churches, and create opportunities that will last for generations. And if we do it wrong," Carlos shrugged, "then it's just a hole in the ground with some shiny rocks in it. The mountain has a way of protecting itself from those who would abuse its gifts." As Sam Tucker sat in an underground chamber, holding a box of silver coins blessed by a long-dead priest, with a donkey who might have lived for more than a century standing beside him, he realized that his life had just taken a turn toward something far greater than he'd ever imagined possible. The $2 donkey hadn't just led him to wealth, he'd led him to purpose, responsibility, and a story that stretched back through generations of faithful guardianship. Now it was Sam's turn to prove himself worthy of the trust. The custom-made donkey harness that Tom Bradley had crafted in his leather shop was a work of art as much as it was functional equipment. Made from the finest cowhide and brass fittings, it bore Jeremiah's name tooled into the leather, along with decorations that honored both the donkey's service and the Santa Elena mine's heritage. Tom had refused payment for the work, saying it was the least Red Creek could do for their most famous resident. Sam adjusted the harness on Jeremiah's shoulders as they prepared for their first official day of mining operations. 3 weeks had passed since the discovery of Father Sebastian's journal and the box of Spanish silver coins. 3 weeks of careful planning, legal paperwork, and quiet preparations that had transformed Sam Tucker from a struggling rancher into the operator of what might become Arizona's most productive silver mine. "Easy there, partner," Sam murmured as Jeremiah shifted slightly under the new harness. "I know it feels different from the old rope rigging, but Tom made this special for you. You're going to be the best-dressed mining donkey in the territory." The donkey's response was a gentle nudge against Sam's shoulder, a gesture that had become their standard greeting. In the weeks since their partnership had begun, Sam had learned to read Jeremiah's moods and signals with an accuracy that amazed even Carlos. The old caretaker often joked that Sam and Jeremiah communicated better than most married couples. Behind them, the Santa Elena mine hummed with activity for the first time in over a century. Carlos had spent the previous week updating the mining equipment, installing modern safety features, and mapping the most promising silver veins. The other donkeys and mules had been fitted with similar harnesses, each one crafted by Tom Bradley with the same attention to detail and respect for their service. Sarah emerged from the mine officer restore building that had once housed the Spanish foreman, carrying a clipboard and wearing the satisfied expression of a woman who just balanced books that showed substantial profits rather than mounting debts. The transformation in the Tucker family's financial situation had been dramatic and swift. The Spanish silver coins from Father Sebastian's box had provided immediate relief from their debts, while the mine's first silver ore samples had attracted serious interest from buyers in Phoenix and Tucson. The assay reports came back from Phoenix, Sarah announced, her voice carrying barely contained excitement. "The silver content is even higher than Carlos estimated. At current market prices, we're looking at ore worth $1,200 per ton." Sam felt his knees go weak. $1,200 per ton? "And that's from the preliminary samples," Sarah continued. "Carlos thinks the deeper veins will show even higher concentrations." Carlos emerged from the main tunnel, his clothes dusty from a morning spent marking ore deposits. At 68, He moved with renewed energy, as if the reopening of the mine had given him a purpose that transcended his years. "The mountain's been generous with us, Sam. More generous than I dared hope." "How much ore are we talking about?" Sam asked. "Conservative estimate?" 5,000 tons of workable ore in the main vein alone," Carlos replied. "Could be twice that when we fully explore the secondary passages." Sam did the mathematics in his head and felt dizzy at the result. Even at conservative estimates, they were sitting on millions of dollars worth of silver. More money than existed in the entire Red Creek Valley, more than he dreamed of in his most optimistic moments. But with the wealth came responsibility that weighed heavier than the silver itself. Father Sebastian's letter had been clear about the obligations that came with the mine's treasures. The silver wasn't just meant to enrich its operators. It was meant to benefit the entire community. "Carlos," Sam said carefully, "we need to talk about how we're going to handle this. Not just the mining, but what we're going to do with the profits." The old man nodded approvingly. "Been wondering when you'd bring that up. Shows you understand what El Fiel saw in you." They walked to the restored mine office, where Sarah had spread territorial maps and modern county surveys across a large table. Red Creek appeared as a small dot in a vast landscape, surrounded by ranches and farms that struggled with the same challenges the Tuckers had faced: poor soil, unreliable water, and markets too far away to be profitable. "I've been thinking about Father Sebastian's instructions," Sam said, studying the maps. "About the silver serving its proper purpose. What if we use part of the profits to help our neighbors? Water projects, better roads, maybe even attract some businesses to the area?" Sarah looked up from her calculations with the smile that had made Sam fall in love with her 15 years ago. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've already started making lists of what the valley needs most." Carlos pulled out a worn notebook and opened it to pages covered with his careful handwriting. "I've been keeping track of ideas for 20 years, thinking about what this mine could do for the community when it finally reopened. Water wells for the ranches that need them. Scholarships for young people who want to go to college, maybe. Even a medical clinic so folks don't have to drive 2 hours to see a doctor." The scope of their potential impact was overwhelming. Sam thought about Bill Henderson at the bank, who'd been nothing but professional despite the Tuckers' financial struggles. About Martha Fleming, who'd helped with historical research and never charged for her time. About Pete Martinez, who'd called the auction that started everything. And Tom Bradley, who'd crafted Jeremir's harness as a gift. "There's something else," Sarah said, pulling out a folder she'd been carrying. "I've been researching the legal aspects of mining operations. If we establish the Santa Eulalia mine as a community trust rather than a private enterprise, we can ensure the benefits are distributed fairly and permanently." "A community trust?" Sam asked. "It means the mine belongs to everyone in the valley. Not just us," Sarah explained. "We'd be the operators, but the profits would be managed by a board of trustees representing all the local families. That way, the wealth gets shared according to need, and no one family controls everything." Carlos smiled broadly. Father Sebastian would approve of that arrangement. He always believed the mountain's gifts belonged to everyone who respected them. The sound of hoofbeats from the canyon entrance interrupted their planning. Sam looked up to see a dust cloud approaching not one rider, but several. As the group came closer, he recognized familiar faces from Red Creek: Bill Henderson, Martha Fleming, Pete Martinez, and half a dozen other townspeople. "Looks like word's getting around," Carlos observed. Sam walked out to meet the visitors, with Jeremir falling into step beside him. The donkey's presence had become a source of confidence, a reminder that he wasn't facing these challenges alone. Bill Henderson dismounted and approached with the measured pace of a man who'd heard remarkable stories and come to verify them personally. "Sam," he said, extending his hand, I hope you don't mind us coming out unannounced. The stories reaching town are extraordinary. No secret to keep, Sam replied, shaking hands with each visitor. Though I suppose it's time for some explanations. What followed was the most surreal conversation of Sam Tucker's life. Standing in the shadow of a mountain that held millions of dollars in silver ore, surrounded by neighbors who'd known him as a struggling rancher, he explained how a $2 donkey had led him to a treasure that could transform their entire community. Martha Fleming listened with the intense attention of someone recording history as it happened. Pete Martinez kept shaking his head in amazement, muttering about the strangest auction result he'd ever witnessed. Bill Henderson maintained his banker's composure, but Sam could see the excitement building behind his professional demeanor. So what happens now? Henderson asked when Sam finished his explanation. Now, Sam said, looking at Jeremiah and then at the faces of his neighbors, we find out if Red Creek is ready to become the most prosperous valley in Arizona. The murmur of excitement that rippled through the group was audible proof that Sam Tucker's life and the life of everyone in Red Creek was about to change forever. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, Sam stood with his neighbors and his faithful donkey, knowing that tomorrow would bring the beginning of a new chapter not just for him, but for an entire community. The $2 investment was about to pay dividends beyond anyone's wildest imagination. The silver nugget necklace Sam had crafted for Sarah gleamed in the morning light as she fastened it around her neck, its simple beauty reflecting the transformation that had swept through their lives in the past month. He'd shaped the pendant himself from the purest silver the Santa Elena mine had produced, working in the evenings by lamplight to create something that honored both the mountain's gifts and their enduring love. It's perfect, Sarah whispered, touching the pendant with reverence. Not too fancy, but beautiful enough to remind me every day how blessed we are. Through their bedroom window, she could see the activity that had become routine around the mine site. Carlos was leading the donkey crew toward the main tunnel, their harnesses gleaming with brass fittings and their step lively with purpose. The animals had adapted to their renewed working life with enthusiasm that spoke of genetic memory, as if mining was what they'd been born to do. The main silver vein had exceeded everyone's most optimistic projections. In just 4 weeks of operation, they'd extracted ore worth more than most ranches in the valley earned in a decade. But more important than the wealth was the way it was being distributed. True to Sam's vision and Father Sebastian's guidance, the Santa Elena Community Trust had been established with representatives from every family in the Red Creek area. Sam emerged from the kitchen carrying 2 cups of coffee, his expression carrying the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd found his true calling. Bill Henderson's coming by this morning with the final trust documents, he said, settling beside Sarah on their porch swing. After today, it'll be official. The mine belongs to everyone. Any regrets? Sarah asked, studying her husband's face. We could have kept it all for ourselves, you know? No one would have blamed us. Sam considered the question seriously, as he did most things these days. The weight of stewardship had changed him, deepening his natural thoughtfulness and adding a gravity to his words that others had begun to notice and respect. Not for a second, he said finally. Money you earn yourself feels different than money you're given. But money you're entrusted with, that feels different still. Better. Somehow. More meaningful. The sound of vehicles approaching drew there. Attention to the road, where a convoy of trucks and cars was raising a substantial dust cloud. Word of the mine's success had spread beyond Red Creek, attracting attention from Phoenix, Tucson, and even mining companies from as far away as Colorado. Looks like today's going to be interesting, Sarah observed. Sam nodded, but his attention was focused on Jeremiah, who stood in his corral with his ears pricked forward, studying the approaching visitors with the intensity of a sentry evaluating. Potential threats. The donkey's behavior had become an reliable indicator of people's intentions friendly toward those who came with honest curiosity, wary of those who arrived with schemes and greed in their hearts. The first vehicle to arrive was Bill Henderson's familiar sedan, followed by Martha Fleming's ancient pickup truck. But behind them came cars Sam didn't recognize. Expensive sedans with out-of-state plates and occupants wearing city clothes. Unsuited to desert conditions, Carlos emerged from the mine office and walked toward the gathering vehicles, followed by several of the donkeys who seemed to understand that their presence might be needed. The old caretaker had developed an almost supernatural ability to sense trouble, and his expression suggested he was detecting something concerning about their unexpected visitors. The first stranger to approach was a well-dressed man in his 50s, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the confident smile of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Mr. Tucker? I'm James Morrison from Southwest Mining Consortium. We've heard remarkable things about your operation here." Sam accepted the offered handshake but didn't invite Morrison closer to the mine entrance. Something in the man's manner reminded him of the slick cattle buyers who occasionally passed through Red Creek, full of smooth talk and promises that rarely benefited the sellers. "Always happy to meet folks interested in mining," Sam replied carefully. "Though I should mention that the Santa Elena mine operates as a community trust. Any business discussions would need to involve our board of trustees." Morrison's smile tightened slightly. Of course. Though in our experience, community operations often benefit from professional management. We've successfully acquired and modernized dozens of small mining operations throughout the Southwest. Acquired? Martha Fleming's voice carried a sharp edge as she joined the conversation. "Mr. Morrison, I hope you understand that the Santa Elena mine is not for sale at any price. Everything's for sale at the right price, ma'am." Morrison replied with the patronizing tone of a man who'd never been told no by people he considered his social inferiors. "We're prepared to make an offer that would set everyone in this valley up for life." Carlos stepped forward, and the donkeys flanked him like an honor guard. "Mr. Morrison, I think you misunderstand the situation here. This mine doesn't operate according to the usual business principles. It operates according to much older principles that can't be bought or sold." Morrison looked around the group with barely concealed frustration. He'd clearly expected to find simple country people overwhelmed by sudden wealth and eager to cash out to the first sophisticated buyer who appeared. Instead, he was facing a united community that seemed immune to his usual persuasion techniques. "Gentlemen, ladies," Morrison said, his tone becoming more aggressive, "you're sitting on millions of dollars in assets. Surely you can see the wisdom of partnering with experienced professionals who can maximize your return on investment." "Our return on investment is just fine," Sam said quietly. "We're not looking for partners, and we're not looking to maximize anything except the benefit to our community." Morrison's facade of friendliness disappeared entirely. "Mr. Tucker, I don't think you understand the complexities of modern mining operations. Without proper corporate structure and professional management, small operations like this inevitably fail. We're offering you a chance to avoid that failure. And I'm telling you," Sam replied, his voice carrying the authority he'd developed over weeks of making decisions that affected dozens of families, "that we appreciate your interest. But the Santa Elena mine is not available for purchase, partnership, or any other arrangement you might have in mind." The confrontation that had been building beneath polite words finally surfaced when Morrison made the mistake of stepping toward Jeremiah's corral with the obvious intention of examining the mining equipment stored nearby. Jeremiah's reaction was immediate and unmistakable. The old donkey moved to block Morrison's path, his ears flattened and his posture radiating warning. Behind him, the other donkeys and mules arranged themselves in a line, creating a barrier between the stranger and the mine entrance. "Your animals seem poorly trained," Morrison observed with obvious disdain. My animals, Carlos said with quiet pride, are excellent judges of character. The insult was clear, and Morrison's response revealed the true nature beneath his polished exterior. This is a ridiculous situation. You people have no idea what you're dealing with. Mining operations require capital, expertise, and connections. You simply don't possess. Within a year, you'll be broke and begging for help. Bill Henderson, who'd been quietly observing the exchange, stepped forward with the documents that would formalize the community trust. Mr. Morrison, I think it's time for you and your associates to leave. These people have made their position clear. As the unwelcome visitors departed with obvious anger and muttered threats about missed opportunities and foolish decisions, Sam felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The first test of their resolve had been passed successfully, but more than that, he realized that somewhere in the past month, he'd stopped being a struggling rancher who'd gotten lucky. He'd become the guardian of something precious, the steward of a treasure that belonged not to him, but to everyone who understood its true value. The silver nugget around Sarah's neck caught the sunlight as she took his hand, and Sam Tucker knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he was exactly where he was meant to be. The bronze plaque mounted beside the Santa Elena mine entrance bore words that Carlos had labored over for weeks, wanting to honor both the mountain's gifts and the faithful service of those who protected them. Cast in Phoenix and installed, with ceremony befitting its significance, the plaque read, "In memory of Father Sebastian Morales, Miguel Mendoza, and Elfield guardians of the mountain's treasures. May all who enter here remember that the greatest riches are those we share." Sam ran his fingers over the raised letters, feeling the weight of history and responsibility they represented. 6 weeks had passed since the mine's official reopening, and the transformation of Red Creek had exceeded everyone's expectations. Wells had been drilled for struggling ranches. The town's one-room school had been expanded into a proper education center, and plans were underway for the medical clinic Carlos had dreamed of for 20 years. Jeremiah stood beside the plaque, as if he understood its significance, his aged eyes reflecting a contentment that spoke of purposes fulfilled and duties properly discharged. The donkey had become something of celebrity, with visitors traveling from across the state to see the animal, who'd led his owner to one of Arizona's richest silver discoveries. "He seems peaceful," Sarah observed, joining Sam at the mine entrance. "More peaceful than I've ever seen him." "I think he's finally home," Sam replied. Not just back where he belonged, but back to doing what he was meant to do. The recognition ceremony had been Martha Fleming's idea, but the entire community had embraced it with enthusiasm that spoke of genuine gratitude. Representatives from 12 counties had attended, along with the territorial governor and several mining industry officials who traveled from as far away as Colorado to witness the remarkable story of the Santa Elena mine. But for all the outside attention, the heart of the celebration remained local. The families of Red Creek and the surrounding valley had gathered to honor not just the discovery of wealth, but the wisdom with which it was being managed. Children who would benefit from the mine's educational trust played in the canyon while their parents planned community projects that would have been impossible dreams. Just months earlier, Carlos emerged from the mine office carrying the leather journal that had started everything. Father Sebastian's careful records of Jeremiah's early years of the Santa Elena. The old caretaker had decided to donate the journal to the Territorial Historical Society, but not before sharing its contents with the community that had become the mine's beneficiaries. "I've been thinking about what Father Sebastian wrote," Carlos said, opening the journal to a passage he'd marked with a ribbon. "Elfield knows that true treasure is not what we take from the earth, but what we build upon it. I think he'd be proud of what we've accomplished here." The accomplishments were visible everywhere Sam looked. The mining operation itself had become a model of sustainable extraction. taking only what the mountain could provide without damage to the environment or the spiritual significance of the place. More importantly, the wealth generated was flowing through the community like water through irrigation channels, nourishing growth and opportunity wherever it reached. Pete Martinez, the auctioneer who'd reluctantly sold Jeremiah for $2, approached with a grin that had become permanent. Since the mine's success, Sam, you realize you've turned the most ridiculous auction purchase in Red Creek history into the most brilliant investment anyone's ever made. Wasn't an investment, Sam corrected gently. Was an act of faith. Faith in something I couldn't see, but somehow knew was there. The crowd that had gathered for the recognition ceremony included faces from Sam's entire journey, neighbors who doubted his sanity at the auction, business owners who'd extended credit when times were hard, and community members who'd embraced the mine's community trust model with enthusiasm that surprised even its creators. Bill Henderson stepped forward with documents that represented the culmination of weeks of legal work. The Santa Elena Community Trust was now officially established, with provisions ensuring that the mine's benefits would extend through generations. Education funds, infrastructure improvements, medical care, and economic development all supported by silver that had waited in the mountain for more than a century. Sam, Henderson said formally, on behalf of the Red Creek Valley Community Trust, I present you with the deed establishing the Santa Elena mine as a permanent community asset. Your stewardship has exceeded everyone's expectations. Sam accepted the document, but his attention was focused on Jeremiah, who had moved to stand directly beneath the bronze plaque. The donkey's posture radiated satisfaction, as if he were surveying work well done and duties properly fulfilled. The real credit belongs to him, Sam said, gesturing toward Jeremiah. I just followed where he led. As the formal ceremony concluded, and the crowd began to disperse into smaller groups discussing future projects and possibilities, Sam found himself alone with Jeremiah at the mine entrance. The donkey had remained motionless beside the plaque, as if standing guard over the promises it represented. Well, partner, Sam said quietly, we did it. Everything Father Sebastian hoped for, everything Carlos worked toward, everything the mountain was waiting to provide. You brought us all home. Jeremiah turned his head toward Sam with an expression that seemed almost human in its intelligence and gratitude. For a moment, the years seemed to fall away from the old donkey's face, revealing the young animal who'd first arrived at the Santa Elena mine more than a century ago, ready to serve and protect and wait for as long as necessary. Then, with a gentleness that spoke of deep contentment, Jeremiah lowered his head and rested it against Sam's shoulder. The gesture felt like a blessing, a transfer of guardianship from one faithful servant to another. As the sun set behind the canyon walls, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Sam Tucker stood with his arm around the donkey who'd waited lifetimes for this moment. The Santa Elena mine hummed with quiet activity. The community trust ensured prosperity for generations. And the greatest treasure of all, the knowledge that some forms of wealth can't be measured in dollars filled. Sam's heart with a richness no silver vein could match. The $2 donkey had led them all to exactly where they needed to be. And his work was finally completely done. The new auction block that Red Creek erected in the center of town bore a bronze inscription that transformed the symbol of judgment into one of hope. Let all who gather here remember that every creature has value, and the greatest treasures often come with the humblest appearance. 5 years had passed since Sam Tucker's impulsive $2 bid, and the weathered wooden platform had been replaced with something that honored both the town's history and its transformed future. Sam stood before the gleaming new auction block on a crisp October morning, his hand resting on Jeremiah's neck as they watched the weekly livestock auction proceed with a prosperity, an optimism that would have been unimaginable in the old days. The Santa Elena mine had continued to produce beyond everyone's expectations. Its silver funding not just Red Creek's growth, but serving as a model for community-based resource management. That attracted attention from across the nation. Pete Martinez, still calling auctions despite his advanced age, had developed a tradition of beginning each sale with the same words. Remember, folks, you never know when $2 might change your life forever. The phrase had become Red Creek's unofficial motto, appearing on signs, business cards, and the letterhead of the Santa Elena Community Trust. The trust itself had grown into something Father Sebastian could never have envisioned, but would certainly have approved. What had begun as a mining operation had evolved into a comprehensive community development organization. The trust funded education from kindergarten through college, maintained the region's only medical clinic, and supported small businesses. With low-interest loans that had transformed Red Creek from a struggling desert town into a thriving center of sustainable prosperity. Martha Fleming, now in her late 70s but still sharp as desert sunlight, had established the Red Creek Historical Society in the back room of her general store. The Spanish horseshoe that had started Sam's investigation sat in a place of honor, along with Father Sebastian's journal and photographs documenting the mine's remarkable story. Visitors came from around the world to learn about the donkey who'd led his owner to fortune and the community that had chosen stewardship over greed. Quite a journey from that day you bid on him, Martha said, joining Sam beside the auction block. Though I suspect you knew even then that something special was happening. Sam smiled, remembering the mixture of instinct and desperation that had guided his hand up that day. I knew he was worth more than $2. I just never imagined how much more. Jeremiah had aged gracefully in the 5 years since the mine's reopening, his coat now completely gray and his step measured by the wisdom of years. But his eyes remained bright with intelligence, and his role as the unofficial mascot of Red Creek's transformation had given him a dignity that transcended his humble origins. The donkey spent his days in comfortable retirement, though he still insisted on making weekly inspections of the mine with Carlos, who at 73 remained the operation's spiritual guardian as much as its practical supervisor. The two of them would disappear into the mountain for hours, checking on the silver veins and the underground stable where Jeremiah's companions continued their work with the same dedication their ancestor had shown. Sarah emerged from the trust office across the street, carrying the monthly reports that showed the mine's continued productivity and the community's expanding prosperity. As the trust's administrator, she developed into a formidable manager of resources and people, ensuring that the Santa Elena's wealth reached every corner of the valley while maintaining the principles Father Sebastian had established. The Phoenix investors are here again, she announced with the weary tone of someone who'd fielded such inquiries monthly for 5 years. Same offer as always, different company name. Sam shook his head in amazement. Despite repeated explanations that the mine was not for sale at any price, corporate representatives continued to arrive with increasingly elaborate proposals for purchase, partnership, or modernization of the operation. Each delegation left, frustrated by the community's unwillingness to prioritize profit over principle. "What did you tell them this time?" Sam asked. "Same thing I always tell them," Sarah replied with satisfaction. "That they're welcome to visit, learn about our model, and apply our principles to their own operations. But the Santa Elena mine belongs to the people of Red Creek Valley, and that's never going to change." The afternoon auction proceeded with the kind of energy that came from buyers who had money to spend and sellers who didn't need to sacrifice quality stock to pay bills. The Santa Elena Trust's agricultural loans had allowed local ranchers to improve their herds, upgrade their equipment, and expand their operations without the crushing debt that had once defined rural life in the region. When the day's final lot was sold, Pete Martinez laid down his gavel and approached the small group gathered around Jeremiah. At 85, the auctioneer moved slowly but maintained the sharp eye and quick wit that had made him a legend in livestock circles throughout the Southwest. "You know," Pete said, scratching behind Jeremiah's ears with the familiarity of an old friend, "I've called thousands of auctions in my life, sold everything from prize bulls to worthless nags. But I've never made a sale that meant more than this old fellow here." Sam nodded, understanding the weight behind Pete's words. The $2 transaction had become more than a purchase. It had become the foundation story of an entire community's transformation, proof that value wasn't always apparent to the casual observer. As the crowd dispersed and the October sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Sam found himself alone with Jeremiah beside the new auction block. The donkey stood quietly, his attention focused on the canyon country that had been his true home for longer than anyone could comprehend. "You did it, partner," Sam said quietly. "Everything you were meant to do, everything you waited so long to accomplish. Father Sebastian would be proud. Carlos is proud. And I'm grateful every day that I was smart enough to see what everyone else missed." Jeremiah turned his head toward Sam with the same intelligent gaze that had caught his attention at that first auction 5 years ago. But now there was something else in those dark eyes, a sense of completion, of duties fulfilled and purposes served. The donkey stepped closer to Sam and gently placed his head against his partner's chest, a gesture that had become their private ritual of trust and affection. But this time, the touch carried weight beyond their usual communication. It felt like gratitude, like blessing, like the passing of guardianship from one faithful servant to another. As the first stars appeared in the desert sky, Sam Tucker stood beside the auction block that had been rebuilt to honor the overlooked and undervalued, with his arm around a donkey who taught an entire community that the greatest treasures often come disguised as things others throw away. The Santa Elena mine continued to produce silver that funded dreams and opportunities that reached far beyond Red Creek Valley. But the real treasure had always been the lesson Jeremiah had brought with him, that faith, patience, and the wisdom to see value where others see only worthlessness could transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. In the distance, the lights of Red Creek twinkled with the prosperity and hope that had grown from a $2 investment in something everyone else thought was worthless. And in the quiet of the desert evening, an old donkey who'd waited more than a century to come home finally rested in the knowledge that his work was complete, his purpose fulfilled, and his legacy secured in the hearts of people who would never forget that sometimes the greatest gifts come with the longest ears. The story that had begun with laughter at a dusty livestock auction had become a testament to the transformative power of seeing potential where others see only problems, and finding treasure in the very things the world discards. Sam Tucker had bought a donkey for $2 and discovered riches beyond measure. But more than that, he'd learned that the most valuable things in life can't be bought at any price. They can only be recognized, treasured, and shared with those wise enough to understand their worth.